I don't think there's anything more beautiful than a cemetery in the fall. Throughout, I love cemeteries, no matter what season. There's normally an abundance of majestically tall trees, more than you typically find in a public park, but not so many that they obstruct your view. Like in the woods, at the peak of autumn, you're treated to the panoramic vista of vibrantly colored foliage dangling from the branches and blanketing the ground, rustling in the wind and crunching underfoot. The gravestones themselves have a prophetic allure to them. Ruggedly cut slabs of polished slate or granite or marble, their dark bodies glistening ever so slightly in a dappled sunlight, miraculously arranged row by row of solemn aspect, to those stand in the memorial too. What I love most about this cemetery and the tranquility is the quiet. Aside from the occasional funeral, they often entirely empty of visitors, and virtually never have seen more than a few at a time. The memento mori of rotting corpses, only 6 feet underground, must be sour to most people on the otherwise gorgeous landscaping. Not me, though. I guess I'm something Mr. Anthropomorphic loner to seek outside solitude confines a graveyard. But reminders of mortality don't bother me. It's comforting, if anything, that we set aside much charming sanctuaries for the dead. It was on the first day of October 2018 when I came across a new cemetery, one that I've never been to before or even knew existed. I was taking a scenic route home around the countryside roads to admire the fall landscape when I spotted weathering gravestones up ahead. Pleasantly surprised at my discovery, I turned in without a second thought and corridored a metal arch over the gates that only read cemetery. If the sign had been born to a name, those letters had long since rusted away. It wasn't a large cemetery, maybe a little 100 yards across by a couple of hundred long with a single looping gravel path, so I parked my car and explored it on foot. I was immediately enthralled by its pristine silence. I couldn't even hear the most distant sign of human activity. The only noises that were cawing of crows, scampering of small animals, and the wind blowing through the trees. The towering oaks and the maple boles that populated the graveyard were stunningly dressed for their fall colors beneath the somber gray sky. But the gravestones themselves were a different story. None of them were recent, and the most were worn that they couldn't be read anymore. There were two structures, two standing on top of the grounds, depiculated remains of this maintenance shed and a small marble mausoleum. My entrance bared the iron gate. As I walked the entire length of the cemetery, searching for any sign of recent activity. Paint overgrowth was limited, but it looked more like a grazing wildlife than a groundskeeper, so I came to the conclusion that the place must be abandoned. I was ecstatic. A small, quaint, aged cemetery all to myself. I came back a couple days later and reclined myself up against a large gravestone. That, though, gave the best view, and with a book in one hand and a pumpkin spice latte in the other, I wasn't usually so casual about my behavior of cemeteries. In case some came across me that deemed disrespectful, but after a brief web search on Nicosia yielded absolutely nothing about the cemetery, and I was certain that it was abandoned. If there is one thing anyone found it creepier than cemeteries, it's abandoned, isolated, decaying cemeteries. I was quite confident that I wouldn't be bothered, and that the long-forgotten person beneath me would be grateful for any attention at all prolonged neglect. Once I had finally finished my drink and a couple of chapters of my book, I decided to get up and stretch my legs a bit. I nearly screamed out loud when I saw a man in a long black coat with wide-brimmed hat standing over a grave near my cemetery exit. It was more ordinary cemetery, his presence wouldn't been much cause for concern, but it was so utterly convinced that at this point it had been abandoned for ages, that it seemed to be next to impossible, that he was just paying his respects. My mind immediately assumed the worst, that he had seen come here and hoped to take advantage of my isolated state. If I were to scream at the top of my lungs out there, would anyone else be able to hear it? I dropped back down to behind the gravestone, waiting to see what he would do. He continued standing over some graves, barely moving, giving no indication that he even knew I was there. I pulled out my phone in hopes of calling someone to pick me up, but only see that I had no reception. Not entirely unexpected, given the role I was in, but I still cursed my luck. 20 minutes to a half an hour went by with no change, and I realized it was going to start getting dark soon. I decided I was better off to walk past this guy in the daylight than to risk being trapped with him at the graveyard at night. And it was like I completely defenseless either. Being a woman with a parchment and wandering by herself in lonely areas, I had a habit of carrying a small can of mace on my person, and I had taken some basic self-defense classes. Gathering my fangs with my mace concealed in the large palm of my hand, I set towards the exit. Following my route kept me furthest from the stranger. I kept the gate steadied and breathing soft and level, and my gaze over flicking back and forth between the car and the dark figure. At the sound of my footfalls drawing nearer, listlessly he lifted his head, gave me a perfunctory nod, and to my great relief, he let me pass without incident. A few days went by before I went back to the cemetery. My encounter with the stranger left me a bit spooked, but since he had done nothing to actually threaten me, maybe his presence had been innocent after all. All I knew was that the spot was far too beautiful to be secluded to give up without a tangible treat to my safety. I went out for another leisurely country drive that eventually took me back to the cemetery, and as soon as I pulled into the entrance, there he was once again, or possibly he was still, since he was standing over the exact same grave with his back to me. Part of me wanted to back up and get the hell out of there, but at this point I honestly was more curious than scared. If he intended to do me harm, he would have done it the first time we were in the cemetery together, and it didn't really make sense that he'd be lurking out in the open to ambush me days after off the chance I would come back on. So why the hell was he doing then? And how did he get there? I didn't see any other vehicles around, though I had escaped my attention during my first encounter. Now that I wasn't concerned, he didn't look nearly as threatening as he did before. Instead, he seemed to be a forlorn, almost tragic figure standing over the grave. My curiosity was piqued, and I resolved to not give up on the cemetery. So I decided to speak with him, shooting off a text of acquaintance as a minimum precaution, which he didn't seem to be thanks to some of the poor reception. And my palming mace, I stepped out of my vehicle and approached him. As I got closer, I became more confident, as I could see his coat had a lot of bulk and that he was rather frail man. He had a sharp cheekbones and overshrunk cheeks and under darkly circled eyes. He was pale, but his skin also was odd, almost silvery luster to it. If it makes sense, his hair was white, too white for someone to look 50 at the oldest, but the oddest of all was his eyes. They were an incredibly vibrant shade of green that stood out like two burly gemstones in his silvery white face. It would have been a shame to have made such beautiful eyes. I thought, not that it would stop me. Excuse me, sir," I squeaked out as I was only a few feet away from him. He raised his head and turned it around towards me, his face sternly melodic, but otherwise friendly enough. "I apologize if I'm intruding, but I saw you by this grave a few days ago. It's just got me wondering if all the graves of this place, far too ancient for any living person to ever known to be buried in them, so I was just curious at what you were doing there." The man understandably seemingly aware of the oddness of what he was doing. "The person buried here was an ancestor of mine. Never knew them personally, but their deeds have been felt throughout my family for generations, and it's been a tradition to honor them for that," he said in a hoarse voice. "I'm the last of my bloodline now, so the honor falls to me alone." I turned my gaze over the moss-covered grave, scrunching as best I could. but failed to discern the identifying features of the outline then a cross. It was a single purple rose placed on top of the ground, and several silver dollars placed along the base of the gravestone. "Oh, what about you, miss?" he asked. "What brings you to this place?" "Oh, I just like cemeteries," I admitted sheepishly. "They're pretty and quiet." The man nodded with a slight smirk. How did you get here?" I asked. "Did someone drop you off, or you live nearby?" "The latter very much so," he admitted, pointing towards the enormous evergreen tree. Beneath the sagging branches was a tent, along with some plastic totes and canvas bags. "Oh, you're squatting here?" I asked simply as I could. I was secretly relieved to see the situation was starting to make at least a bit of sense. A secluded place like this was a perfect place to squat, and his homelessness explained the immigrated frame, his poorly fitted coat, even his prematurely white hair. But we're miles from the nearest stone. You don't walk all the way and then haul supplies on the way back, do you?" "I have enough to last me until the end of the month, and then after that it won't matter," he replied. I mulled over asking what he meant by that, but decided it was better off. I wasn't unsure of his mental state, especially since I could see no evidence of this rather humble grave belonged to some venerated ancestor. I deemed it to be best to leave him believe it what he wanted. I slipped the malice back into my pocket, pulled out my coin purse. "May I?" asked, gesturing to put a few rolls of coins that he had along the base of the gravestone. He nodded appreciatively, and I left a token of my payment to his ancestor, or him, for using their graveyard. "Is it all right with you if I keep visiting? I do really like it here." "It's not my cemetery, miss." "Do it as you please," he said. "Thank you," I smiled. I headed back to my car for my coffee. I paused when I attempted to ask him his name. I couldn't do that, though, without offering mine in exchange. As harmless now as it seemed, I still thought it's best not to give him any compromising information about myself. I visited the cemetery often for the rest of October, the foliage growing more vibrant, with beautiful as the months progressed. I bought some pumpkins from the roadside stand and spent an afternoon carving them into jack-o'-lanterns and scattered them across the grounds. I befriended the semi-feral barn cats that came here to hunt. I played with the piles of leaves like a little girl. I pressed my favorite ones into my scrapbook and generally did whatever the hell I felt like. One day, I examined each grave one by one, nothing down anything I found interesting. Angels' crosses could still be made out of somewhat headstones, but the only legible words were generic phrases like "gone too soon," "beloved wife," "husband," etc. Of course, may he or she or they rest in peace. Not one gravestone had a date or name left on it. It struck me strange, but of course, I honestly had no idea what to make of it. Each time I entered the cemetery, I'd leave a few more coins by the ancestor's grave as an offering. Sometimes the man would be standing there, but sometimes he'd be in or around his tent. Other times he'd be walking around the rest of the graveyard, and sat on at least one occasion. I wasn't sure if he wasn't there at all, though I had no idea where he would have gone. We acknowledged each other politely, but spoken seldom. We were both there because we wanted to be left alone. After all, I do realize that me going myself to the cemetery with a possibly crazy homeless man might sound reckless. But after all, my first time we spoke, we just never got the impression that he was dangerous. There was only one time he took an issue from any of my activities, and that was when I tried to gain entry to the mausoleum. I was fiddling with the lock, thinking it could possibly be old, and I could probably just break it, when I felt his cold hand grab my shoulder from behind. "That's a private mausoleum, miss. Do not open to the public," he said firmly. "Leave it be." Looking back on it, I will say he probably wasn't justified putting his hand on me when he reprehended a loan that would have suffocated. But at the same time, I felt so much intense sensation of being caught of doing something I wasn't supposed to do it. I squeaked out an apology and scurried off to examine the maintenance shed instead. Most interesting thing I found was the old, non-motorized lawnmowers. On my next visit, I brought him a deli sandwich, partially as an apology for attempt to grave robbing, partially because I bought one for myself and didn't feel like eating right in front of the homeless person, but also in hopes of getting some information out of him. He accepted it politely, but not exactly gratefully, more like it was a pack of store-brand socks from a secret Santa. He didn't seem to care what he ate or what he underfed, but he was sure that he'd make it through the end of the month, and that was enough for him. "So how long have you been here already?" I asked, between bites of my Reuben sandwich. "Since I buried my father," he murmured. "Buried him here?" I asked in surprise. "Wasn't enough for a proper burial, but it was concentrated ground, so it was good enough," he said with a distant nod. "I'm sure you did the best you could," I assured him. His vague, cryptic answers did make a little uneasy, but I had developed a sense of camaraderie with my fellow graveyard enthusiast, and decided to give him the benefit of the doubt, at least for the moment. "So how much do you know about this place? I haven't been able to find anything about it. How old is it? Does it have a name? Why don't any of the tombstones have names or dates on them?" The man just shook his head. "All lost to time. Most of us are forgotten in less than 100 years after we pass. No sense in the stones keeping names when those names won't mean anything to anyone," he claimed. I just nodded and finished my sandwich, but I didn't necessarily disagree with the statement, but hardly explained the condition of the gravestones. I briefly entertained it through maybe he had chipped off all the dates and names, but quickly dismissed it in the notion. None of the gravestones appeared vandalized, just old. I eventually settled in on the theory that the headstones had been mass-produced with genetic phases, pre-engraved, and my personal information only being cheaply and shallowly carved. Explaining why it hadn't rolled away, it wasn't a perfect theory, but it was the best I could think of. During the last week of October, there was a heavy rainstorm, and when it tried to lighten, I tossed in my coat and drove out to the cemetery, eager for a small smell of wet leaves and the cool, damp air onto my beloved sanctuary. When I arrived, I saw the grave where I had been leaving my offerings had been dug up. Baffled, I ran to the car to open grave without shutting the door behind me. To my horror, I beheld a man, muddied and barely conscious, lying at the bottom of the freshly dug 4-foot hole. He had evidently decided to take advantage of the rain, softened earth to exhume the grave, but his fragile, half-starved state has exclusion for the chill of the rain that had been too much for him. Without hesitation, I jumped out of the grave and grabbed him underneath the armpits and hoisted him up. "What the hell are you thinking?" I demanded. I slung his body up to the ground. "I had to know for sure," he mumbled. That was the only lucid sentence I got from him for a while. I dragged him back to his tent, cleaned him up, put a blanket over him, and got some water to him. He recuperated, and I started to thinking of what exactly my obligations were. I had known that he probably wasn't mentally well, but I'd also thought he was harmless, just a creepy loner who liked to hang out by graveyards like me. But clearly whatever the delusions he clung had just caused him to nearly took his own life. If I didn't at least try to get him help, and he died, was I at fault for it? If I didn't get him help, then who would? But his delusions even leave him the creepy cemetery in peace. The thought of him being dragged out of there by the cops to be locked up in the muzzle of the asylum was soul-crushing. There was even more selfish concern of what would happen to the cemetery if I brought it up to the attention of the government officials. I had been so fallen in love with it, I had seriously started considering buying a camper and squatting there myself. "Thank you." I was rose from my temptation by the shameful apologetic murmur from my tent mate. "You're lucky I came here when I did, dummy," I said, giving a punitive slap across the knee. "Otherwise, you would have been just another nameless corpse right now. What were you trying to do? Do you even know?" "It doesn't matter." He shook his head. I groaned, and shoved a cup of dollar store instant ramen into his hand. "Look, I can't just stay here all night. Are you going to be okay by yourself?" I asked. "Yeah, miss. I'll be fine, thank you, he nodded. Promise me you won't do any more digging or anything else that might get you nailed over, I demanded. I promise, miss, he swore. I sighed and accepted that would have to do. I do have a small favor to ask, miss. And what's that? I asked, putting my raincoat back on. Halloween's my last night here, he said. If it's not too much trouble, would you mind seeing me off? Of course, now I wanted to know where I thought he was going, but given his mental state, I figured that it wouldn't do any good to ask. If Halloween was some sort of Lucius for his delusions, then it was probably best for him not to be alone. Well, it's not like I had any other plans, I quinced. Sure, I'll be here at dusk. I'll bring drinks and stuff. We'll have a little Halloween party. I always meant to go to one of those. The Halloween night came, and I set out a bowl of fun-sized candy bars with a please take 2 note post on it, and drove off to the cemetery. I brought chips, dip, whiskey, and ginger ale coolers, and a sandwich platter. Halloween candy was my Bluetooth speaker, and downloaded a Halloween playlist that mostly had covers of This Is Halloween, Monster Mash, and Spooky Scary Skeletons. Maybe not the wildest evening, but it was literally the first party I've ever thrown, so cut me some slack. When I pulled into the cemetery, I saw that he had placed a trash can in the center with a started bonfire. It's surrounded by my jack-o'-lanterns. I was a little concerned about the safety of his, but might attract attention. But it did look amazing, and the night it was cold enough for the warmth of the blaze to make the party much more enjoyable. This looks awesome, I cried, as I got out to my car and donned to my kitty mask, putting out the spread of my car's hood. All I did was put some leaves in the trash can and lit a match. You're the one who took the time to carve the pumpkins, he said humbly, perched up on the headstone and staring into the fire. Yeah, I'm a real Michelangelo with gourds, I said sarcastically, handing him a fox mask. This time, you're not leaving me hanging tonight. You're going to eat the food I brought, and you're going to enjoy it. You're not only my guest, but I will not have you spoiling the evening for everyone else. Yes, ma'am, he chuckled, helping himself to the sandwich platter. I pulled out my phone and hit play on my music app and started dancing to Jonathan Young's cover of the Ghostbusters theme song. Normally, I'm pretty self-conscious with social gatherings, to the point where I avoid them as much as I can without being rude. But since he is the only person that there was ever more reserved than I was able to cut it loose a bit. I danced around the fire, sang, I drank, feasted, and generally just made merry. It was the most fun I have ever had at a party. A couple of hours and I was taking a breather, leaning up against my car, monologuing at the man, who about nothing in particular. When a strong winds of gust picked up and blew out the fire in the trash bin, I was immediately taken back, especially since all the jack-o'-lanterns stay lit. The cold had set in immediately, and it was so cold that I could see my breath and frosting forming at the mouth. In a sparse of candlelight, I could see that the man was rose from his normal melancholy. He cracked his neck forward as I showed the gaze. I saw a blue pail with blue flames appear in one, hovering in midair of each grave. Miss, stay in the ring of the jack-o'-lanterns, and you'll be safe, he said. Quite deliberately, he stepped outside the ring. I don't want you anyway. Your offerings have been more than significant, and I'm the one who owns them debt. Wait, what are you doing? I whispered. I told you tonight's my last night here, he said. The wind picks up again, howling like a wild dog, and yet it seemed weightlessly at Parsons remained exactly where they were. What are those things? I asked, spinning around frantically with surreal sages of fool's fire. The will-o'-wisps, he said solemnly. The spirits who have been dead for so long, they no longer remember their human lives, and thus cannot summon human form. They appear here on every Hallows Eve, and when the veil breaks the ender world, ours is our weakness. You've been seeing these things before? I asked, bewildered at the supernatural skeptical and the mundane reaction to it. So they're not dangerous? No, they are, but the jack-o'-lanterns are effectiveness war is against them, he assured me. The wisps started to move now, very gently, needless of the wind, slowly bobbing towards the man. Then what are you doing? He hung his head out and let out a sigh of resignation. I broke my promise to you. I finished digging up my ancestors, though, and placed myself a little more time. It was exactly what I was told. In Immense's corpse, incorruptible, perfectly preserved after lying in each earth for centuries. But despite the perfect condition, I can't tell you a damn thing about it, even if it was a man or a woman. But part of the deal was made earlier with the elder things so not long ago. They traded their identity to ensure the prosperity of our family, burying their corpse there in the cemetery, hallowed to the elder things. It's why there's no names on the graves anymore, and the wisps stole them, desperate for any semblance of humanity. This is why this place is so hard for most people to preserve, let alone remember. Listen to me. You're not thinking clearly. Those things are just oxidizing gases from graves. I choked out, not believing in myself. Let's just get in my car and leave, and you'll see we'll be fine. Do not leave that ring until they're gone, he ordered. The wisps slowly but steadily drawing nearer. I have to do this. Part of my ancestors' deal with the Elder Fanes was that each of their direct descendants would sacrifice themselves as well eventually. Every one of us who broke that pact never brought the increasing misfortune upon us, until there was just me. I thank you. I thought this place would have been forgotten after I was gone. I don't know why you can see or remember it, but so as long as the wisps won't be able to steal its identity completely. So as long as you remember me, they won't be able to steal mine. And you did take my last month just a little more pleasant. Thank you. The wisps were all around him now, spinning like a languid vortex, nipping at him gently as if testing his mettle. His breath hung thick in the air, and frost began consisting with his skin and clothes. When he shivered it like it was 50 degrees below zero, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a key ring. The cemetery may not be mine, but the mausoleum is, he said, throwing the keys into the ring of jack-o'-lanterns. It's yours now, and everything inside it. Before I could ask anything more, the wisps engulfed them massive, and he was smothered into the cold blue flames. But he didn't burn. Instead, each wisp seemed to take a bite out of him, each piece turning into a dark, fluid vapor, with flames greedily devouring him, even without leaving a skeleton behind. I shamefully was not a hero that night. I screamed and cried to see the sight of him being eaten alive, weeping and cowering as the wisps circled my protective ring. All I could do was pray the jack-o'-lanterns would not burn out. Since that night, I've been wandered off often if I should be mad at him for inviting me to watch him die like that, or if he had been told ahead of time. I would never have believed in him, and would have insisted on being here anyway to make sure he didn't harm himself. Even afterwards, I couldn't even believe it if I had witnessed it myself. I never could have thought of what had happened to him otherwise. I am glad that he didn't have to die alone, so I think it's better this way. It's hard to stay mad at the dead anyway. Once I knew exactly how special the cemetery really was, I followed through my plans on to live here. I gave my landlord 1 month's notice, bought a camper and some solar panels, and sent myself up near the woods in the back. I placed a proper front of the entrance, where I threw my spare change in the hopes of plating my elder things might be watching. Since I bought a couple of people out here just to test what the man told me, and all I can remember about was I have some trailer out in the back in the middle of nowhere that they could never find without me. They can't even remember it's a cemetery. I spend most of my free time there now, despite what happened. And about this place, I still love it, and even decided it was best to not take what I found in the mausoleum out of the cemetery. It was filled with tombs, glamorous, honest-to-God spellbooks, and a cult of knowledge, presumably accumulated by the man's ancestor. I have been studying them too. I've becoming more of a hedge witch, you could say, and I know exactly what my first grand working to be. Don't think it's fair that the man had given himself to the wisps because of his deal with his ancestor maid. I don't believe in all the sins of father or anything like that. I know I didn't know him for that long or that well. I still don't even know his name, but my standards at least. We shared this fairly inmate to mate. He was my friend, and I would do more than that to remember him. I plan to take his spirit back from the wisps to make him my familiar. That is why, for Halloween of 2019, I'll be throwing another party, this time one wicked enough to wake the dead.